I knew my marriage had cracks, but I never expected the husband I slept beside for 8 years to start a war with a message colder than steel. I thought my heart would break. I was wrong. The only thing breaking was the system of comfort he parasitically fed on. What Dean failed to realize is when you threaten to leave for leverage, sometimes the other person simply steps back and lets you fall into your own trap. My name is Barbara Whitmore. I am 41 years old, and I serve as the Chief Operating Officer of Belrose Civic Systems, a massive urban infrastructure corporation headquartered right here in Charlotte. For nearly a decade, my daily existence has been defined by concrete, steel, and unyielding city grids. My professional life demands stability. It requires discipline. It relies on extreme predictability. I built the vast majority of our family wealth on those very principles. Earning a high corporate income in the infrastructure sector requires a mind that anticipates structural failure long before a bridge ever cracks. Yet, despite all my training and risk assessment, I somehow missed the catastrophic foundational collapse happening right inside my own home. My husband, Dean Holloway, is 37 years old. He runs a boutique interior design studio and hosts a moderately popular lifestyle podcast. If you asked him what he does for a living, he would confidently tell you he is building a brand. He curates aesthetics, speaks endlessly about creative synergy, and meticulously constructs a life that looks absolutely stunning on camera. But the harsh reality, hidden behind the designer curtains, is that his actual income has always been wildly erratic. Some months he brings in a modest profit, but most of the time, his business operates entirely because I serve as the invisible financial safety net beneath his grand artistic visions. I am the silent investor who never asks for a return on capital. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just walked out of a grueling 3-hour strategy meeting with our board of directors. The air in the underground parking garage was heavy and damp. My heels echoed sharply against the concrete as I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and picked up my phone to check my pending notifications. There was a single text message waiting for me from Dean. The message read exactly like this: "All communication must go through my lawyer. Divorce papers in." I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The sudden shock that seized my chest did not stem from the actual word divorce. It was the clinical, absolute nature of his phrasing. In the span of a single sentence typed on a smartphone, Dean had completely severed our 8 years of marriage. He had instantaneously repositioned me from his devoted wife to his sworn legal adversary. There was no preceding argument. There was no emotional plea for counseling. There was only the cold, calculated execution of a preemptive strike. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the evening Charlotte traffic. The yellow streetlights bled across my windshield as my mind began to race backward, forcefully cataloging every red flag I had actively chosen to ignore over the past few years. Dean had always possessed a theatrical flair for grievances. Whenever he felt frustrated about our financial arrangements, or my demanding corporate schedule, or the simple fact that my universe did not constantly orbit around his vibrant social calendar, he would drop passive-aggressive hints. He would half-joke about packing his bags and leaving. He would dramatically sigh and wonder aloud if an ambitious corporate woman and a sensitive creative soul were truly compatible. I had always written those moments off as the temperamental outbursts of an artist feeling constrained by my rigid logic. I never realized he was actually conditioning me. He was training me to constantly work harder, to bend further backward, just to keep him comfortable. I did not drive straight home. Instead, I pulled into a quiet suburban parking lot and dialed the one person I knew could anchor my spinning mind. Nora Kessler is a veteran family law attorney whose reputation in the city is built on being so intensely sharp that she makes panicking feel like an absolute waste of time. I relayed the exact contents of the text message to her. I fully expected her to offer some standard legal platitudes or soothing words. Instead, the line remained perfectly quiet for a brief moment before she spoke. Nora asked me a single, piercing question that snapped my reality into incredibly sharp focus. She asked me, "If he has already placed you on the exact opposite side of the legal table, Why in the world are you still planning to fund his daily life? I sat in the dark car, listening to the soft hum of the engine, and felt a freezing wave wash over my entire body. She was absolutely right. For years, I had willfully blurred the lines of our household finances. I never audited his invisible contributions to our life. I never questioned the endless stream of expenses required to maintain his studio space, his podcast equipment, or his networking dinners. I paid the bills, covered his deficit margins, and blindly assumed the heavy financial lifting because I deeply believed I was protecting a marriage. It had never dawned on me that I was merely sponsoring a parasitic personal brand. Dean was not just my husband. He was my most expensive dependent. And now, this dependent had hired a lawyer to sue me for the very assets I had generated while he was busy picking out imported fabrics. When I finally arrived home, the house was completely empty. The silence inside the living room was absolute. I did not pour a glass of wine to soothe my nerves. I stayed perfectly still. I walked straight past our designer furniture, entered my home office, turned on my laptop, and bypassed the shared household ledger we usually reviewed together. Instead, I logged directly into the master electronic banking portal. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The harsh blue light from the monitor cast long, sharp shadows across my desk. I began pulling the raw electronic statements from the past 6 months, meticulously scanning them line by line, without the rosy, forgiving filter of our marriage. The raw data told a brutal story of its own. As I scrolled through the endless pages of transactions, my eyes caught a distinct pattern. There were several recent, highly specific outbound cash transfers and premium credit card charges. They were massive sums of money. And none of these expenses aligned with any business trip, client project, or personal anecdote Dean had ever shared with me over the dinner table. He had not just decided to ask for a divorce today. He had been quietly, methodically preparing for this legal war for a very long time, and he had been using my own money to pave his exit route. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The man I had shared a life with for years had meticulously weaponized my own trust against me. Every overtime hour I had worked, every stressful board meeting I had endured to secure our future, had simply been a funding source for his secret departure. The sadness evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, operational clarity. If Dean wanted a legal adversary, he had severely underestimated the kind of executive he just challenged. The sun rose on Wednesday morning, bringing a harsh, clear light into the kitchen. I did not feel the exhaustion of a sleepless night. Instead, a supreme, terrifying mental clarity had taken over. By 7 in the morning, I was already sitting at the dining table with a black coffee, a legal pad, and Nora on speakerphone. She did not offer sympathy. She offered a tactical blueprint. We called it the firewall. My first target was the lifeblood of his daily existence. Under Nora and her strict legal guidance, I logged into every single banking portal and began the systematic dismantling of his financial umbilical cord. I clicked on the user management settings for my premium credit accounts. With 3 firm keystrokes, I revoked his authorized user status on all the primary spending cards. Next, I navigated to the automated transfer schedules. For years, a set amount of several $1,000s had quietly shifted from my executive payroll account into his studio operating fund on the 1st and 15th of every single month. I deleted the recurring rule. The screen refreshed, confirming the cancellation. The joint checking account required a more delicate approach. Nora advised me not to drain it entirely, as family court judges despise financial ambushes that leave one party absolutely destitute. Instead, I temporarily froze the outgoing transaction functions and transferred exactly 50% of the liquid cash into a secure separate account solely under my name. I meticulously documented every penny left in the joint ledger. Total transparency was my armor. I was not hiding marital assets. I was simply stopping the uncontrolled bleeding while we waited for formal legal orders. By 9 in the morning, I moved on to structural liabilities. Dean leased a gorgeous, light-filled commercial loft for his design studio downtown. He loved telling his podcast listeners about the sheer hustle required to secure such prime real estate. What he conveniently omitted was that the commercial landlord only handed over the keys because my corporate income and my immaculate credit score were listed on the personal guarantee document. I drafted a formal, legally binding email to the property management group, officially withdrawing my status as a personal guarantor for any future lease renewals, extensions, or default liabilities. The business was his. If his brand was truly as successful as he claimed, his own revenue could secure his future. Then came the easiest, most satisfying cut of the morning. Dean held an elite membership at an exclusive downtown creative club. He used it as his personal stage, buying rounds of expensive drinks and networking with wealthy clients, constantly projecting the image of a highly successful, self-made creative genius. The monthly dues were astronomical. I called the club concierge, verified my identity as the primary account holder, and canceled the membership effective immediately. Within 48 hours, the velvet ropes completely dropped. Dean went from floating on a soft cushion of endless, invisible corporate money to standing on the cold, hard ground of his actual bank balance. He was finally forced to look at a real number. The reaction was instantaneous. By Friday afternoon, Nora called me with a highly amused tone in her voice. Dean had retained Mallory Pike, a lawyer known across the city for aggressive, noisy tactics. Mallory had been blowing up the office phones all day. The demands were not about saving the marriage or discussing couples counseling. Mallory was aggressively demanding an emergency injunction for temporary spousal support. Nora read the list of his supposed urgent needs over the phone. I sat in my office at Belrose Civic Systems, looking out over the Charlotte skyline, and let out a sharp, bitter laugh. In the real world, a financial emergency means a lack of basic food, essential medication, or a roof over your head. In the constructed reality of Dean Holloway, a financial emergency consisted of past due invoices for imported Italian tiles, valet parking fees, and the upcoming month of rent for his luxury design studio. He was entirely panicked, not because he had lost the love of his life, but because the venture capitalist funding his lifestyle had suddenly and permanently closed the vault. That weekend, I walked through our expansive townhouse with a completely different perspective. I was no longer looking at my safe home. I was conducting a physical inventory of a crime scene. As I moved from the living room to the guest quarters, a strange realization crept over me. The space felt slightly hollow. I stood in the center of the reading room and noticed the empty corner by the window. A very expensive, custom-upholstered velvet armchair was missing. I walked out into the main hallway. The handcrafted walnut console table we had purchased just 2 months ago was completely gone. At first, a small part of my brain thought he might have taken them to stage a client house for a photo shoot, but my new, clinical mindset refused to accept simple, innocent excuses. I opened my laptop and began to cross-reference the recent credit card statements with the physical items actually sitting inside the house. The discrepancy was absolutely staggering. Dozens of high-end furniture pieces, luxury imported rugs, and expensive designer lighting fixtures had been purchased using the family credit cards over the last 90 days. None of them were inside our home. I dug deeper into the digital transaction logs, tracing the vendor names, the delivery addresses, and the shipping manifests. Near the bottom of the second page of a massive credit statement, hidden between mundane grocery trips and gas station charges, I found the anomaly. It was a recurring monthly charge for a large commercial storage facility located 30 miles entirely outside the city limits. I sat perfectly still, staring at the digital invoice glowing on the screen. The implication hit me with the overwhelming force of a freight train. Dean had not just woken up one day and impulsively sent a text message asking for a divorce. He had not just emotionally checked out of our marriage over the past year. He had been methodically purchasing luxury assets on my dime and secretly moving them into an off-site storage unit. He was physically liquidating our marital funds, turning my hard-earned cash into untraceable designer furniture and stockpiling it to furnish his future bachelor life. He had prepared for this separation logistically, financially, and completely behind my back. He honestly thought he was a brilliant strategist. He thought I would be far too blinded by heartbreak and shock to ever check the billing receipts. But he forgot one crucial detail about the woman he married. I manage billion-dollar city infrastructure budgets for a living. I do not cry over missing chairs. I trace the supply chain. I locate the hidden warehouse, and I meticulously prepare to burn his entire illicit operation straight to the ground. The total silence from Dean was the loudest noise in my entire life. 72 hours had passed since the financial firewall went into effect. I fully expected a barrage of angry phone calls, frantic emails, or a dramatic confrontation in the driveway. Instead, I received absolutely nothing. He was playing an intricate waiting game, hoping the sheer weight of his sudden absence would force me to capitulate and restore his funding. But the perimeter around me was far from quiet. Since the main adversary refused to show his face, his proxies began to emerge from the woodwork. On Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a notification from my legal counsel. Instead, it was a message from Elise Harper. Elise and her husband Trevor lived 3 doors down in a sprawling, meticulously manicured neo-colonial estate. They were the neighborhood socialites, a couple whose primary occupations seemed to be hosting extravagant charity galas and aggressively minding everyone else's business. Her text was dripping with manufactured, sugary sympathy. She wrote that she and Trevor were deeply concerned about our situation. She insisted Dean was in the middle of a severe mental crisis and desperately needed grace. She literally typed the words, telling me I needed to go easy on him because creative men are incredibly fragile. The sheer audacity of the message made my blood run cold. I did not reply with a text. I did not want a written record of my reaction. I wanted to hear the exact cadence of her voice. I dialed her number immediately. Elise answered on the first ring, feigning breathless, innocent surprise. I asked her point blank why she felt compelled to manage the emotional temperature of my marital separation. Before she could stumble through an excuse, Trevor suddenly intervened, picking up an extension on their end of the line. His tone was slick, coated in the arrogant, unearned familiarity of inherited wealth. He suggested that dragging this dispute out into the public eye would be detrimental to my pristine corporate reputation. Then, he casually mentioned that with my third-quarter executive bonus scheduled to clear in exactly 6 weeks, and my restricted stock units vesting shortly after, a quiet and highly generous settlement would ultimately be in my best interest. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. Trevor and Elise Harper knew the precise, granular timeline of my corporate compensation structure. Those were highly confidential financial details, locked securely within my employment contracts. Dean had absolutely no business discussing my equity vesting schedules at a neighborhood cocktail hour. The Harpers were not acting as concerned friends reaching out in a time of need. They were acting as his informal leverage. They were explicitly reminding me that they held my financial blueprints and could easily make things very uncomfortable for me within our elite social circle. The strategy of silent, creeping encirclement escalated the very next morning at Belrose Civic Systems. My office is a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel located on the 40th floor, a place where personal drama is entirely forbidden. At exactly 10 in the morning, David, the sharp young paralegal assigned to my division, knocked tentatively on the glass. He stepped inside and securely closed the heavy door behind him. He looked visibly uneasy, shifting his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. David informed me that the corporate compliance hotline had received a highly unusual anonymous call just an hour earlier. The caller did not make a direct, actionable accusation. Instead, they posed a series of pointed hypotheticals regarding the executive morality and ethics clause embedded in the contracts of our chief officers. The anonymous voice specifically asked how the board of directors typically handles high-ranking executives who become involved in contentious, highly publicized, and financially disputed divorces. I sat back in my chair and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city traffic crawl far below. It was a brilliant, venomous chess move. Someone, and I knew exactly who orchestrated it, was actively trying to frame the narrative before we ever stepped foot inside a courtroom. They wanted to weaponize my own career trajectory against me. The underlying message was unmistakable. If I fought Dean over the marital assets, he would ensure the collateral damage bled directly into the corporate boardroom. He wanted me to believe that I had infinitely more to lose at the negotiation table than he did. He thought the imminent threat of professional embarrassment would terrify me into signing a massive check just to make him go away quietly. I thanked David, instructed him to log the interaction officially without raising an alarm, and sent him out. I did not flinch. I did not panic. I simply categorized the threat. Late that evening, back in the cavernous, echoing silence of my townhouse, I opened my personal laptop. I bypassed the standard banking portals and logged directly into the shared cloud storage drive we used for household management. I wanted to see exactly what kind of digital footprint Dean had left behind before he initiated this war. I navigated past the digital folders containing our tax returns, property deeds, and utility receipts, scrolling straight to the system trash bin. There it was. A single digital folder had been moved to the trash exactly 4 days ago, just hours before he sent that initial divorce text. The folder was boldly titled Reset Plan. The clinical audacity of the name sent a sharp, cold thrill through my veins. He had literally created a project management folder for the dissolution of our marriage, treating my life like a corporate restructuring event. And yet, despite all this extensive machination, my phone remained completely devoid of any direct communication from him. Dean was intentionally holding the line. He was stubbornly clinging to his chosen role as the cold, calculating strategist who held all the cards. He completely refused to be the desperate husband begging for his credit cards to be reactivated. He was waiting securely in the shadows, fully expecting his external pressure campaign through the Harpers and the anonymous corporate threats to shatter my resolve. As I stared intently at the highlighted folder on my screen, a new message notification chimed loudly in the quiet room. I glanced down at my phone. The sender was Tessa Holloway, Dean's younger sister. Tessa and I had never been particularly close, but over the years, we had developed a silent, unspoken understanding regarding her brother's profound entitlement and his perpetual need to be coddled by the women in his life. Her text was brief, completely devoid of any traditional greetings or polite pleasantries. Her message was blunt. I think you should know a few things before it is too late. I looked from my illuminated phone screen back to the computer monitor. The digital restore button hovered right next to the reset plan folder, begging to be clicked. All the answers were likely locked inside that deleted directory: his timelines, his financial accomplices, his ultimate monetary targets. I rested my finger heavily on the trackpad. Then, I slowly pulled my hand away. I decided to leave the folder sitting entirely untouched in the digital trash bin for now. Opening it immediately would give me raw data, but it would not give me the psychological advantage I needed. I needed to see exactly how far he was willing to push this elaborate charade. I needed the agonizing silence to stretch just a little bit longer. I had to know the absolute, unfiltered truth of his underlying intentions before I made my next move. I had to see if Dean was truly terrified of losing the woman he married, or if he was simply terrified of losing his administrative access to her empire. 5 exact days had passed since the digital firewall completely severed his access to my capital. I pulled my car into the driveway of the townhouse just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the brick facade. I shifted the vehicle into park and turned off the engine. Through the windshield, I saw him. Dean was sitting on the front steps of our home. There was no aggressive lawyer flanking him. There was no calculated, strategic distance. The meticulously curated professional facade he usually projected to the world had entirely evaporated. He looked rumpled, exhausted, and remarkably small sitting on the stone porch of the property my income secured. The confident man who had typed that sterile, commanding text message less than a week ago was nowhere to be found. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking methodically against the pavement. I did not rush toward him. I did not pause in shock. I walked toward the front door with the steady, measured pace of an executive walking into a hostile boardroom. My face was a mask of polite indifference. He stood up as I approached, nervously brushing lint off his designer trousers. I waited for the predictable script. I fully expected a soft apology or perhaps a desperate declaration of how much he missed his wife. Instead, his mouth opened, and his very first sentence was a complaint born of pure, unadulterated financial panic. He looked at me, his voice tight with anxiety, and stated that he honestly did not think I would cut everything off so incredibly fast. I stopped on the second step, standing exactly 1 foot below him, yet maintaining unbroken, dominant eye contact. I kept my voice perfectly level, entirely devoid of any anger or sorrow. I calmly reminded him that he explicitly demanded all communication go through legal counsel. I told him I simply respected his specific, written boundaries to the absolute letter. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his own hubris. The grand illusion of the fiercely independent creative genius shattered right there on the porch. Dean began to speak rapidly, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his sudden reality. He confessed, in a frantic, humiliating rush of words, that he was actively drowning. He admitted he could not afford the upcoming studio rent. He could not cover his daily living expenses. He was entirely locked out of the elite lifestyle he had grown so accustomed to flaunting. The man who had confidently initiated a legal separation was now standing on my doorstep, completely panicked because he could not pay for his own existence without my authorization. As his anxiety peaked, the ugly, unvarnished truth finally spilled out of his mouth. He waved his hands frantically in the air, dismissing the severe legal papers he had filed as if they were merely an administrative misunderstanding. He blurted out the actual terrifying purpose behind his threat. He never actually wanted to end the marriage. The divorce filing was a carefully fabricated crisis. He admitted his intention was to use the severe legal threat to force me into a state of blind, emotional panic. His grand strategy was to make me realize I was neglecting his needs, forcing me to dramatically slow down my rigorous corporate career. He fully expected me to beg for reconciliation. Once I was sufficiently broken, he planned to demand we sell our current townhouse, liquidate the equity, and pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into a massive new commercial showroom for his struggling design business. He desperately tried to reframe the extortion to make himself sound like a martyr. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes and called his legal filing a necessary wake-up call. He claimed he only did it to make me truly value our marriage again. I stood perfectly still in the cool evening air, letting the chilling reality of his confession wash over me. I looked straight through his pathetic, therapeutic jargon and saw the absolute core of his intention. It was never about reigniting our love. It was never about fostering emotional connection. It was pure, calculated leverage. He had weaponized the very concept of our family to extract venture capital for his failing brand. He kept talking, digging his grave deeper and deeper with every single syllable. He confessed that his wealthy peers had advised him on this exact predatory tactic. They had convinced him that highly successful, financially driven women only ever agree to change their behavior when they believe they are about to permanently lose something deeply valuable. They told him to manufacture a devastating loss, to threaten my core emotional stability, so I would obediently open my checkbook to buy back his presence in my life. I let a thick, suffocating silence hang in the space between us. I watched him fidget under my cold, clinical gaze. He was a man who had meticulously built a bear trap, stepped directly into the center of it, and was now furious that I refused to pry the steel jaws open for him. I finally spoke, my tone dropping to a quiet whisper that cut significantly sharper than any screaming match ever could. I asked him the only question that truly mattered in that moment. I asked if he truly wanted me to love him more, or if he simply wanted me to be more obedient. Dean completely froze. His jaw snapped shut, and the frantic, nervous movement of his hands stopped instantly. The blood seemed to drain entirely from his face as the sheer brutal honesty of the question dismantled his entire fragile narrative. He could not formulate an answer. Any response he could possibly give would openly admit that he viewed our sacred vows as nothing more than a restrictive employment contract he was aggressively trying to renegotiate through emotional blackmail. He stared at me in the fading light, his eyes wide with the sudden, terrifying realization that his carefully constructed manipulation had failed spectacularly. He was no longer dealing with a heartbroken, compliant wife. He was dealing with an adversary who had completely deciphered his playbook and held all the remaining chips. He took a slow, defeated step backward, his defensive posture returning as he realized he had just voluntarily handed me the exact confession I would use to destroy his case in court. He looked at the concrete pathway, unable to meet my eyes for even a second longer. His final words hung in the evening air. Pathetic, hollow, and entirely devoid of authority. He quietly pleaded, asking me to please just promise not to turn this entire situation into a war. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not agree to any terms. I simply turned around, unlocked the front door, stepped inside the fortress I owned, and closed the heavy oak door firmly in his face. He stood out there alone in the dark, begging for a peaceful surrender, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that he was the one who had gleefully fired the very first shot. On Wednesday morning, Nora introduced me to Owen Price. Owen was a forensic accountant who operated out of a nondescript office building downtown. He was a quiet, meticulously organized man, but Nora assured me he was absolutely lethal to individuals who built their entire existence on surface appearances. He did not care about aesthetic branding or creative visions. He cared solely about ledgers, hidden digital footprints, and the cold, unyielding truth of mathematics. We sat in the glass-enclosed conference room of Nora's firm as Owen projected his preliminary findings onto the large wall monitor. He had spent the last 48 hours tearing straight through the past 90 days of our shared financial history. The sheer volume of raw data he uncovered turned my stomach into a heavy block of ice. He brought up a complex spreadsheet detailing the dozens of missing luxury items I had begun to catalog in my mind. Owen revealed exactly how Dean had masked the entire operation. Dean had actively classified those massive furniture purchases as temporary staging materials for upcoming client projects. He used our primary household operating budget to pay the vendor invoices directly, completely draining the liquid funds meant for our mortgage, property taxes, and daily living expenses. But those expensive imported items were not sitting in any client home awaiting installation. Owen had traced the shipping manifests, delivery confirmations, and freight logs directly to the commercial storage facility located far outside the city limits. He then pulled up the commercial lease agreement for that specific storage unit. It was not rented under my name, nor was it under Dean's personal name. It was legally registered to a brand new limited liability company called Hollow House Atelier. The air in the room grew incredibly still as Owen moved to the next slide in his presentation. The hidden furniture was a severe betrayal of marital trust, but the next document he displayed crossed the line into a full-blown financial crime. Owen brought up a digital application for a massive commercial line of credit. The requested amount was $250,000. At the very bottom of the multi-page document sat my personal electronic signature, seemingly authorizing the entire debt. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the digital metadata attached to the file. The timestamp embedded in the document showed the application was generated and signed at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I looked across the table at Nora, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I told her I was sitting in a closed-door zoning commission hearing on that exact day and at that exact time. I did not have my phone. I certainly did not open a banking portal to underwrite a $250,000 commercial loan for a company I had never heard of. Owen clarified that Dean had not successfully drawn the money yet. The application was still pending final executive underwriter approval, but the absolute terror lay in the attempt itself. Dean had actively bypassed my security protocols, forged my digital authorization, and tried to pry open a massive financial door using my pristine credit history without breathing a single word of permission. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, staring at the glowing screen, the narrative I had held onto for years completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I could no longer look at Dean as an immature artist struggling to find his footing in a competitive market. He was not a naive husband overwhelmed by a highly successful wife. He was a deeply calculating, predatory man who viewed my entire corporate career, my reputation, and my massive financial capacity as his own personal infrastructure. I was merely the bank vault, and he truly believed he possessed an absolute, unalienable right to the combination. Owen clicked his mouse again, bringing up the state business registry filing for Hollow House Atelier. He highlighted the official date of incorporation. The company was legally formed exactly 7 days before Dean sent that sterile text message demanding a divorce. Every single move was a premeditated step in a highly structured, ruthless exit strategy. He built a lifeboat using my timber, loaded it with my expensive assets, and tried to secure a massive loan against my name before intentionally setting the ship on fire. A sharp wave of pure, unadulterated rage flared in my chest. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to march straight out of the office, drive directly to his leased studio, and throw the forged credit application right in his arrogant face. I wanted to watch his carefully curated facade crumble into dust as I threatened him with a federal fraud investigation. Nora placed a calm, heavily restraining hand on my arm. She looked at me with the cold, seasoned eyes of a veteran litigator who had destroyed men exactly like him 100 times before. She advised me to hold the line and avoid any direct confrontation. She explained that the most dangerous thing we could possibly do right now was show him our entire hand. She told me that arrogant, narcissistic people often confess the most when they firmly believe the other side is entirely in the dark. If we let Dean continue to think he was the smartest person in the room, he would inevitably make another fatal mistake. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcefully pushing the burning anger down into a cold, tightly sealed compartment in my mind. Nora was absolutely right. I did not want to merely scare him or win a brief shouting match. I wanted to utterly dismantle his entire constructed reality on the permanent legal record. Exactly 1 hour later, the heavy wooden door to the conference room slowly opened. Tessa Holloway walked in, clutching a small leather handbag tightly against her chest. She looked utterly exhausted, carrying the heavy, suffocating burden of someone caught directly between fierce family loyalty and undeniable morality. She took a seat across from me, her eyes darting nervously toward Nora, before finally settling on my face. She had reached out to me, knowing something was deeply wrong with her brother's narrative. She knew about his grand plans to start a new design firm, but she did not know the sheer, terrifying depth of his deception until I calmly laid the printed credit application and the incorporation documents on the mahogany table right in front of her. Tessa stared at the pieces of paper for a very long time. Her face went pale instantly, leaving her looking hollow and sick. She looked up at me, her voice trembling slightly as the horrifying reality of her brother's actions finally crushed her last remaining hope for a peaceful, amicable resolution. She looked me in the eye and said, "You think he is just threatening. I am not so sure anymore." Tessa sat across the polished mahogany conference table, her shoulders hunched under the crushing weight of her own guilt. She bore the unmistakable expression of someone who knew she had arrived exactly 1 step too late. The heavy realization that she had withheld vital information while I was being systematically hunted by her own brother was going to haunt her for a very long time. She took a slow, trembling breath, purposefully avoiding my gaze as she began to meticulously dismantle the last remaining illusions I had about my marriage. She explained that Dean had not been suffering in silence. Instead, he had been actively bragging to a tight-knit circle of his entrepreneurial friends for over a month. He proudly referred to his impending divorce as a structured exit. It was a term he had clearly stolen from a corporate business podcast, completely bastardizing the concept to apply it to our sacred vows. The entire ordeal was a highly calculated maneuver deliberately designed to force me to the negotiating table. He wanted to permanently alter the balance of power in our household. The grand, terrifying truth was that his initial plan never actually involved him packing his bags and leaving for good. Tessa revealed the malicious precision of his timeline. He chose to serve the legal papers precisely 3 weeks before my massive annual retention bonus was scheduled to clear at Belrose Civic Systems. He knew intimately how fiercely I guarded my professional standing. His strategy was built entirely on the assumption that the sudden, explosive threat of a messy public divorce would induce sheer, unadulterated panic. He confidently wagered that I would eagerly offer a rapid, extremely generous financial settlement just to keep his mouth shut and preserve my immaculate image in front of the board of directors. I was supposed to pay a premium simply for the privilege of a quiet life. The conspiracy extended far beyond his immediate circle of friends. Tessa confirmed my darkest suspicions about our intrusive neighbors. Trevor Harper had not been offering unsolicited advice out of the goodness of his heart. Trevor had firmly promised to connect Dean with a lucrative syndicate of private equity investors. These men were allegedly prepared to fully fund the massive downtown showroom Dean had always dreamed of building. However, Trevor attached one absolute, non-negotiable condition to the introduction. The investors would only open their checkbooks if Dean managed to successfully escape his wife's financial shadow in a highly profitable manner. He needed substantial seed capital to prove his worth, and my bank accounts were the designated target. Dean had even drafted a comprehensive media strategy to accompany his legal assault. Tessa admitted that he was currently preparing to record a special, highly produced narrative episode of his lifestyle podcast. He fully intended to subtly assassinate my character over the airwaves. He planned to weave a pathetic tale about a cold, emotionally bankrupt female executive who treated her sensitive, creative husband like nothing more than a convenient tax deduction. He was actively constructing a public narrative of profound victimization, fully intending to leverage my alleged cruelty to boost his brand engagement and gain sympathy from his wealthy client base. The room grew impossibly quiet as Tessa reached into her leather handbag. She pulled out her smartphone, her fingers shaking slightly as she opened a private group chat application. The conversation involved Dean and three of his closest male confidants. She placed the device on the table and slid it slowly toward Nora. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the harsh digital text. Amidst the arrogant congratulations and vile encouragement from his peers, one specific message typed by Dean stood out entirely. It was a sentence so utterly devoid of humanity that it sent a literal chill racing down my spine. The text read exactly like this: "If she thinks the house is on fire, she will sign absolutely anything." Tessa finally broke down. Tears spilled over her lower lashes as she confessed her own complicity through silence. She told us she had desperately tried to talk him out of this insane scheme several weeks ago. She had begged him to see reason, warning him that manipulating a woman like me would result in absolute catastrophe. But Dean had aggressively brushed her aside. She explained that he was completely intoxicated by the delusion of his own dominance. For the very first time in his entire life, he truly believed he was holding the absolute upper hand over my career and my wealth. He was fiercely addicted to that fleeting synthetic rush of power, and he refused to let anyone derail his moment of triumph. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream, nor did I slam my fists against the table in a fit of rage. I simply sat there, perfectly still. The sheer, calculated magnitude of his betrayal required absolute stillness. My profound silence began to expand, creeping into every single corner of the conference room until the air itself felt as heavy and impenetrable as solid lead. Even Nora, a veteran litigator who had personally witnessed every conceivable form of domestic treachery, watched me with a deeply guarded expression. She recognized the terrifying depth of my calm. It was not the numbness of a broken woman. It was the chilling focus of an executive preparing to neutralize a threat. Nora finally broke the heavy silence. She neatly stacked the printed financial reports and slid the smartphone back across the table to Tessa. Her voice was pure, uncompromising ice. She made the final tactical decision for our campaign right then and there. She instructed me that we were absolutely not going to expose his fraud today. We were going to let the officially scheduled mediation session proceed exactly as his lawyers had requested. Dean was currently marching with supreme confidence straight toward a devastating trap built entirely out of his own boundless hubris. Nora simply wanted to ensure we let him walk all the way inside before we securely locked the heavy steel doors behind him. The inevitable escalation arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing quarterly financial projections when the head of corporate compliance at Belrose Civic Systems requested a private, immediate meeting. He asked me to step into a soundproof boardroom and placed a thick manila envelope on the polished table. It was an anonymous whistleblower packet. The documents inside heavily implied that I had been misappropriating corporate budget funds for personal, unauthorized expenses. It was the exact threat my paralegal had warned me about, fully realized and sitting right in front of me. The old version of me, the dutiful wife who desperately wanted to keep the peace and protect her home, might have panicked. She might have quietly resigned to avoid the scrutiny or frantically called her husband to beg for a truce, but that woman no longer existed. I looked directly at the compliance director, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact, and made a decision that fundamentally shifted the battlefield. I did not get defensive. I did not ask for legal representation from the firm. Instead, I voluntarily handed over my personal laptops, my executive corporate card ledgers, and my complete private banking history. I officially requested a full, unrestricted internal audit of my own department and offered my total cooperation before they even formally asked for it. By throwing the doors wide open, I completely neutralized the weapon Dean thought he held firmly against my head. He had banked his entire strategy on my paralyzing fear of public corporate embarrassment. He assumed I would pay any premium price to keep a messy personal scandal out of the boardroom. By choosing radical, absolute transparency, I effectively removed my own vulnerability. I was no longer a terrified executive desperately trying to hide a collapsing private life. I was a senior leader proactively neutralizing a malicious, unsubstantiated external attack. The sheer brilliance of our forensic accountant became beautifully evident later that afternoon. Owen Cross referenced the specific receipts included in the anonymous compliance packet. The allegations centered entirely around several high-dollar corporate catering and luxury venue rental invoices from the previous fiscal year. Owen traced the dates and the specific vendors, matching them perfectly to a series of panicked requests Dean had made in the past. At the time, Dean had begged me to temporarily use my corporate leverage to secure premium venues for his design showcases, swearing up and down that his studio would reimburse my department by the end of the month. Naturally, his failing business never generated the cash, and I had quietly reimbursed the company out of my own annual salary just to keep his professional reputation intact. Dean had anonymously submitted the initial corporate charges to my employer, conveniently omitting the permanent bank ledger showing I had personally paid the company back every single cent. He had tried to frame me for a theft that he had fundamentally orchestrated, but the absolute transparency of my audit had a beautiful, cascading effect far outside the corporate walls. The elite social circles in this city are incredibly small, and substantial money always talks. Trevor Harper and his syndicate of potential private equity investors conducted their standard due diligence on Hollow House Atelier. The moment Nora filed the formal financial discovery notices to freeze the marital estate, the investors immediately saw the catastrophic reality of Dean and his hollow business model. His entire operation, his grand future showroom, and his projected revenue were entirely dependent on him successfully extracting liquid, undivided marital assets from my bank accounts. When the investors realized I was not quietly surrendering my capital and that he was facing a brutal forensic accounting investigation, they immediately pulled their term sheets. Wealthy men want to invest in a brilliant creative mind, not underwrite a messy, highly contested divorce settlement. The sudden, catastrophic collapse of his financial safety net triggered an instantaneous shift in his legal strategy. For weeks, Mallory Pike had been a relentless, aggressive force, bombarding our office with demanding emails and threats of hostile litigation. Suddenly, the tone shifted completely. On Thursday afternoon, Mallory called our office with a voice dripping in manufactured diplomacy. She completely dropped the aggressive demands for emergency spousal support. Instead, she began throwing around soft, therapeutic buzzwords: She gently suggested we pause the aggressive legal filings to focus on marital counseling, personal healing, and mutual de-escalation. I sat in the office, listening to the speakerphone, and felt a cold smile form on my lips. They smelled the absolute danger. They realized the corporate blackmail had failed spectacularly. The private funding had completely evaporated, and the financial firewall I built was impenetrable. They were desperately trying to retreat under the soft guise of emotional maturity, but I had no intention of letting them back out of the arena they had aggressively forced me into. I refused to settle this in a quiet room with soft apologies. I wanted the undeniable truth to be entered into a binding legal record where it could never again be dismissed as mere emotional misunderstanding. That night, the final piece of the puzzle clicked cleanly into place. Owen had successfully bypassed the encryption on the digital trash bin and fully restored the deleted cloud folder. He securely transmitted the contents directly to my personal server. I sat alone in my dark townhouse, the harsh glow of the screen illuminating the quiet room, and opened the primary document titled Reset Plan. It was a masterclass in domestic manipulation. Dean had typed out a bulleted list of strict tactical objectives. The primary directive was explicitly clear. Serve papers before her bonus clears. Ask for immediate emergency support. Frame her as emotionally absent. He had literally scripted my pain. He had carefully scheduled my panic on a calendar. He had deliberately attempted to monetize my heartbreak. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking exactly 2 a.m. I slowly reached out and pressed the lid of my laptop down until it clicked shut. The profound silence of the empty house wrapped around me, but I did not feel lonely. I did not even feel the sharp, suffocating sting of betrayal anymore. The profound grief that had anchored me to the ghost of our marriage had completely vanished. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out into the sleeping city streets. I no longer felt like a devastated woman mourning a lost love. I felt like a person who had just taken a cold scalpel, sliced open the soft, familiar skin of the man I had blindly slept beside for nearly a decade, and finally seen the rigid, calculating metal skeleton operating underneath. The sun had barely set on the evening before our scheduled mediation, when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed violently through the silent hallway. A private legal courier stood on the porch, handing me a thick certified envelope. I signed for the delivery, feeling the stiff, aggressive weight of the premium paper in my hands. It was a formal declaration directly from his legal team, violently shifting their posture from soft conciliation back to absolute, hostile aggression. The document formally accused me of aggressively hiding liquid assets, secretly funneling marital wealth into offshore corporate accounts, and maliciously manipulating our shared household finances to leave him destitute. I spread the crisp pages across the cold marble surface of the kitchen island. As my eyes scanned the fierce allegations, my initial surge of adrenaline flatlined into a state of profound, analytical confusion. The financial figures they cited as concrete evidence were aggressively specific, yet they were entirely wrong. They were quoting projected equity valuations and phantom account balances that had not actually existed in reality for over 3 years. I recognized the exact sequence of the numbers. They were pulled directly from an old, discarded financial forecasting spreadsheet I had briefly saved on my personal home desktop network a long time ago. The only possible way Dean or his aggressive lawyer could currently possess those specific, erroneous digits was if someone had recently bypassed my local residential network security to look directly at my private hard drive. I did not waste a single second panicking. I immediately dialed the chief cybersecurity officer at Belrose Civic Systems. He was a man who owed me a substantial professional favor following a massive corporate infrastructure audit I had protected him on. Within 20 minutes, he ran a silent, remote diagnostic sweep of my entire residential network. The results he delivered over the phone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at sharp attention. Dean still possessed an old synchronized tablet, a device he had carelessly packed in his leather duffel bag the day he moved out of the house. The deep security logs clearly showed that specific tablet had been quietly, persistently pinging my private directories and silently downloading cached personal files in the dead of night for the past 14 days. He had been digitally trespassing in my home while I slept. I immediately conferenced Nora into the secure call. The sheer predatory delight in her voice was unmistakable and deeply comforting. Dean had crossed a massive, terrifying legal line. He was no longer just a manipulative spouse playing a messy game of leverage. He was actively committing digital espionage against a corporate executive. Nora did not hesitate for a single moment. She immediately drafted an emergency ex parte motion for a strict device preservation order and filed it directly with the night court clerk. By legally freezing his electronics and demanding a full digital forensic clone, she brilliantly transformed his sneaky midnight snooping from a mean-spirited invasion of marital privacy into a severe, provably stupid federal violation. If he even attempted to delete his search history or wipe that tablet now, it would be considered intentional spoliation of evidence, a move that would immediately destroy his entire credibility before a judge. The sheer audacity of his mounting desperation peaked just 2 hours later. Close to midnight, my personal email inbox chimed loudly in the dark kitchen. The sender was Dean. He was blatantly breaking his own sacred rule of strictly communicating through legal counsel. The subject line was entirely empty. The message inside was brief, frantic, and chillingly transactional. He explicitly stated that if I simply agreed to guarantee his full premium living expenses for the next 6 months and voluntarily signed an absolute non-disclosure agreement regarding his recent business failures, he would gladly instruct his lawyer to withdraw the divorce petition the very next morning. I read the glowing text on the screen 3 separate times. I did not feel a single ounce of relief. I did not feel a spark of hope for our broken family. That email was absolutely not an olive branch. It was not a desperate plea for marital reconciliation or an admission of guilt. It was a naked, unadulterated extortion letter clumsily dressed up in the noble garments of a romantic compromise. He was literally holding the legal and public status of our family hostage in exchange for a half-year severance package. He wanted a golden parachute for a job he had completely abandoned. My phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was Owen. The forensic accountant never slept when there was blood in the digital water. He had spent the entire evening relentlessly ripping apart the foundational metadata of the Hollow House Atelier corporate registry files. He had successfully unearthed a deeply buried draft of their internal operating agreement. He read the text aloud to me over the phone, his voice steady and clinical. Deep inside the legal document, under the specific section detailing the initial corporate capitalization strategy, Dean had explicitly typed out a firm expectation of a funding event after the divorce. The sheer, calculated cruelty of those 5 simple words anchored me firmly to the hardwood floor. The entire grand theater of this traumatic divorce had absolutely nothing to do with emotional incompatibility, creative differences, or a sudden breakdown of romantic trust. It was an engineered financial bridge. He had intentionally set our shared life on fire strictly to illuminate a clear path toward his new, unencumbered bachelor lifestyle. He fully expected my hard-earned bank accounts to pave that road, so he would never have to lay a single brick himself. He had viewed my potential heartbreak as nothing more than a highly profitable venture capital pitch. The sun rose cold, sharp, and incredibly bright the next morning. I did not wear the soft, neutral pastel colors typically recommended by mediators for a peaceful family resolution. I chose a tailored, charcoal gray suit, cut like absolute armor. I walked out of my townhouse and drove downtown with terrifying clarity. I did not bring a thick briefcase full of emotional pleas, desperate apologies, or defensive financial statements. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the downtown arbitration center, carrying exactly one object. I held a single, immaculate white file box perfectly balanced in my arms. Dean was sitting somewhere on the other side of that sprawling building, nervously drinking coffee, foolishly believing he was about to face a tired, heartbroken wife desperately trying to save her public reputation. He had absolutely no idea the woman walking steadily down the hallway was bringing the complete, undeniable blueprint of his total destruction. The conference room at the downtown arbitration center was freezing, deliberately kept at a low temperature to discourage emotional outbursts. The sprawling mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield. I sat perfectly upright, my white file box resting entirely untouched near my right hand. Nora sat beside me, radiating the calm energy of a predator waiting in the tall grass. Across from us, Dean looked like a man who had spent hours practicing his posture in a mirror. Mallory Pike opened the session. Her previously aggressive, threatening tone had completely vanished, replaced by a soft, practiced cadence meant to project deep empathy. She began by proposing we officially pause the dissolution proceedings. She argued that both parties needed time to prioritize healing. However, she seamlessly pivoted, stating that while we worked on our emotional restoration, Dean required an immediate infusion of spousal support. She classified it as a necessary allowance for his transitional phase. She was asking for a monthly stipend amounting to tens of thousands of dollars to keep him comfortable while he supposedly figured out his feelings. Dean played his part beautifully. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished wood. He rubbed his face, making sure the harsh overhead lighting caught the dark circles carefully cultivated beneath his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was a masterclass in manufactured vulnerability. It was slightly hoarse, dropping an octave to sound heavy with regret. He spoke about the immense pressure of living in the shadow of my corporate success and how he simply needed space to breathe. He looked incredibly credible to anyone who did not know his actual script. He paused, clearly waiting for his cue. He had fully anticipated that this display of broken masculinity would trigger a flood of tears from his overwhelmed wife. He expected me to break down, apologize for my demanding career, and eagerly sign the support check to soothe his wounded ego. I did not give him a single drop of emotion. I maintained absolute, unbroken eye contact. My face was a completely blank slate. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Dean blinked, shifting uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. His rhythm faltered. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked frantically toward Mallory. He was a terrible improviser, and my profound silence was destroying the only scene he had memorized. Sensing her client losing his footing, Mallory called her first surprise witness. The heavy double doors opened, and Trevor Harper walked into the mediation room. He looked smug, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people made in a year. Trevor was officially introduced as a character witness for Dean. For the next 30 minutes, Trevor spun a highly offensive, entirely fabricated narrative. He painted a vivid picture of a cold, ruthless corporate executive who chronically neglected her marital duties. He claimed I treated my husband like a disposable employee, constantly prioritizing board meetings and infrastructure projects over our sacred vows. I felt a brief flash of heat in my chest, but Nora placed her hand flat on the table, signaling me to hold the line. She did not raise a single objection. She did not interrupt Trevor to fiercely defend my honor. She simply let him talk. She let them both weave a massive, tangled web of lies, gently encouraging them to expand their story until their claims became so grand and specific that they could never possibly retract them. When Trevor finally finished his performance and left the room, Nora gestured for Owen to distribute a preliminary financial packet. It was a very basic spending reconciliation sheet, deliberately lacking the devastating forensic evidence we actually possessed. It merely showed a series of confusing withdrawals. Dean looked at the simple spreadsheet and visibly relaxed, falsely believing this was the absolute extent of our financial investigation. He scoffed lightly, dismissing the entire document. He looked directly at the mediator and confidently called the massive missing sums a simple marital bookkeeping misunderstanding. He claimed he had just been sloppy with his receipts. Then, completely unprompted, Dean raised his right hand. He swore, on the official mediation record, that he had absolutely never constructed any future business plans relying on post-marital funds. He firmly stated that his new design venture was completely independent and not reliant on a single cent of my corporate wealth. I glanced toward the glass wall separating us from the waiting area. Tessa was sitting out there, scheduled to be called as our primary rebuttal witness. My heart skipped a sudden beat. She looked entirely terrified. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched her phone. I could see the heavy weight of family loyalty crushing her resolve. Her mother had been calling her relentlessly all morning. For the very first time in this entire grueling process, I felt a sharp spike of genuine fear. If Tessa backed out, my final devastating blow might actually miss its mark. The mediator called for a mandatory 15-minute recess. I stepped out into the quiet hallway, leaning against the cool glass window. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a direct, highly secure text message from the chief legal counsel at Belrose Civic Systems. I opened the message and read the short string of words. The corporate security team had successfully traced the exact origin of the anonymous whistleblower packet that had threatened my career. The originating Internet Protocol address was a perfect, undeniable match to the old wireless router physically located inside the downtown studio Dean currently leased. I locked the screen of my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The fear completely evaporated. I did not even need Tessa anymore. He had handed me the blade himself. We returned to the mediation room. The air was thick with anticipated victory on their side of the table. Mallory slid a formal, legally binding declaration across the mahogany surface toward her client. It was the sworn financial affidavit, summarizing the statements he had just made, explicitly denying any hidden assets, denying any premeditated corporate sabotage, and swearing his absolute financial independence. The mediator formally asked Dean if he understood that signing this document under penalty of perjury made his statements a matter of binding legal fact. Dean did not hesitate. He flashed a devastatingly confident, arrogant smile. He picked up the heavy black pen, leaned over the document, and signed his full name with a dramatic flourish. I watched the dark ink stain the crisp white paper. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched him cap the pen, entirely unaware that the heavy steel door of his own constructed prison had just slammed completely shut, and the lock had permanently engaged behind him. The ink from his signature was barely dry when Nora calmly reached over and lifted the lid off the pristine white file box. The sound of the cardboard shifting was the only noise in the freezing room. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She simply began to deal the documents across the polished mahogany table, like a blackjack dealer handing out absolute ruin. First came the commercial storage facility invoices, perfectly cross-referenced with the delivery manifests of the missing luxury furniture. Dean stared at the papers, his arrogant smile instantly freezing into a tight, panicked grimace. Next, Nora laid down the digital forensic logs provided by my corporate security team, highlighting the exact dates and times his old tablet had bypassed my residential network to scrape my private financial directories. Then came the printed contents of the deleted cloud folder. The bold heading of the corporate restructuring plan sat completely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Nora placed the draft operating agreement for his hidden company right beside his extortion email, the one where he explicitly demanded a full 6 months of premium living expenses in exchange for dropping the divorce petition. Finally, she slid the massive commercial credit application across the wood, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail directly on my forged electronic signature. Mallory Pike, his aggressive and previously confident attorney, physically recoiled from the table, the color completely drained from her face. She looked from the forged federal document down to her client, instantly realizing that Dean had not only hidden the entire truth from her, but he had also just used her to facilitate a perjury trap. Before Dean could even stammer out a defense, Owen stepped forward. He did not use emotional language. He used the clinical, devastating precision of a forensic timeline. He presented the sequence of events with the sharpness of a surgical scalpel. He demonstrated how Dean first incorporated his limited liability company. He showed how Dean then initiated the clandestine transfer of our marital assets out of the house. He proved how Dean had actively verified the exact payout date for my massive annual corporate retention bonus. Finally, Owen linked it all to the exact moment Dean sent that sterile text message demanding a legal separation. It was undeniably a perfectly synchronized sequence designed for maximum financial extortion. The heavy double doors of the arbitration room suddenly clicked open. Tessa stepped inside. Her face was pale, but her posture was rigid with newly found resolve. She had refused to be complicit in her brother's destruction. She walked directly to the table and placed her smartphone down. The screen displayed the private group chat with his wealthy friends. The mediator read the highlighted message aloud for the official record. It clearly stated she will pay to avoid noise. The room erupted into quiet, controlled chaos. Nora immediately demanded that Trevor Harper be recalled to the room to clarify his sworn testimony under the new context of the business plan. When confronted with the documented proof that his private equity syndicate was explicitly waiting for Dean to successfully extract my liquid assets before they funded his showroom, Trevor immediately recognized his severe legal exposure. He realized he was no longer an impartial character witness. He was an active participant in an attempted financial fraud. He stammered a pathetic excuse about a sudden scheduling conflict and practically sprinted out of the arbitration center, completely abandoning Dean to the slaughter. Mallory Pike immediately threw her hands up. She turned to the mediator and desperately requested an emergency pause in the proceedings. She begged to move into a private caucus room, desperately wanting a secure space to aggressively negotiate a damage control settlement behind closed doors. I looked directly across the table at the man I had slept beside for nearly a decade. He was sweating. His hands were shaking. He looked entirely broken. I turned to Mallory and my voice rang out like striking steel. I firmly stated that there would be absolutely no emotional private rooms today. I refused to let him hide his humiliation behind closed doors. Every single word of this resolution was going to be etched into the permanent legal record. The final judgment was swift and utterly merciless. Because of his documented bad faith, his premeditated asset manipulation, and his blatant perjury, the mediator completely stripped Dean of any right to temporary or ongoing spousal support. He was not awarded a single cent to maintain his luxurious transitional phase. Instead, he was legally forced to offset the exact financial value of the expensive furniture he had secretly moved into the storage facility. His demand for a massive emergency cash infusion was entirely annihilated by his own calculated greed. I retained absolute ownership of the townhouse. I secured 100% of my extensive retirement portfolios, and the vast majority of the wealth I had meticulously built with my own hands. After a brutal offset of all his hidden liabilities, Dean walked away with a minuscule, heavily conditional transitional payout that barely covered the massive legal fees he now owed his furious attorney. The fallout in the real world was just as decisive. At Belrose Civic Systems, the anonymous whistleblower threat evaporated the moment I handed over the Internet Protocol trace. The board of directors did not view me as a scandalous liability. They looked at the clean, undisputed audit and saw a chief operating officer who neutralized severe personal attacks with terrifying absolute transparency. My professional reputation emerged completely bulletproof. Meanwhile, without the stolen capital to secure his commercial lease, his brand-new design firm completely dissolved into bankruptcy several weeks before its grand opening day. A month later, I stood alone in the spare room of my quiet townhouse. This was the exact space Dean had slowly and silently drained of its expensive furnishings to secretly build his grand illusion. The room was empty, smelling faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. I ran my hand along the bare windowsill, watching the city lights begin to flicker on against the twilight sky. I am currently remodeling this space into my own private executive study. As I stood there, the final, sharpest realization settled peacefully into my mind. That cold text message did not destroy my life. It never had the power to break me. It simply peeled the cheap, superficial layer of paint off a fundamentally hollow marriage, leaving me standing on a foundation of solid rock. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.